Order, order. So we now begin a one-off session on innovation and eradicating diseases. In the spirit of the festive season, we want to spread the good news of progress on disease eradication whilst recognising the challenges and the distance still to travel. We begin by welcoming Professor David Lalloo and Dr. Lisa Stockdale to the committee. Now I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we have some questions for you. Let's start with you, Professor Lalloo.
I'm David Lalloo. I'm Vice-Chancellor at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. I'm an infectious diseases clinician by background and have worked in a number of different infectious diseases, mostly in low and middle income countries for 30-odd years.
Fantastic, thank you.
Lisa Stockdale. I'm currently the Senior Immunologist at the Jenner Institute at the University of Oxford, working on the R21 malaria vaccine. My previous experience is immunology, public health, and working in low-middle income countries on a variety of infectious diseases.
Well, thank you. Thank you both of you for joining us today. And as we know, tropical diseases, sometimes referred to as neglected tropical diseases because they don't receive the same attention as some other diseases, are a significant burden to a large part of the population globally. Professor Lalloo, what would you describe as the global health burden of tropical diseases?
Well, I think they're enormous and actually very difficult to quantify. And one of the troubles we've had with neglected diseases is that by definition we don't always have good epidemiological data. But the number of deaths and the number of cases affected around the world are phenomenal. And although we've seen some decrease in that in the last 20 years, there's still a long way to go.
Right. And could both of you answer, which tropical diseases would you say are close to eradication, and why have there been more advances for those than for others? I'll start with you, Professor Lalloo.
I think there are, guinea worm, for example, is one of the good examples where there's been a huge progress in close to eradication. We've seen quite a lot of progress with filariasis in certain countries, where we've been filariasis or elephantiasis, as you may know about,
yes,
you may know it by. In certain countries, for example, where there's been concerted UK funding, 12 target countries from different funding over 15 years, we've seen reductions to kind of 99% of the population in those 12 countries are now no longer at risk from filariasis, and that's a direct result of UK funding. So there are areas where we've seen substantial reductions, but that's targeted, and we need to expand that to other countries as well.
Just for those who may not be familiar with these diseases, can you just say a little word about what they involve or what their impact is, like elephantiasis?
So filariasis is a parasitic disease. It's mainly transmitted by exposure to mosquitoes in tropical countries, and the consequences of untreated infection are the development fundamentally of problems with the lymphatics, which can lead to very large leg swelling and also a scrotal edema. Those are the two major consequences of filariasis.
Hence the term, or elephantitis. And it's fantastic to hear that there's progress towards its eradication. What would you say, Dr. Stockdale?
So from my perspective, being a vaccinologist, there has been some progress on leishmania vaccine. So leishmania is leishmaniasis, leishmania. This is a parasitic infection transmitted by the sandfly. It hasn't received very much funding. Obviously, it's a neglected tropical disease and is very much associated with poverty. But there have been some advances in clinical trials of vaccines.
Okay, great. Lauren, can I bring you in here?
Yeah, sure. So this is about a celebration, really. So looking at the last 10, 20 years, the role British science has played in this space. Would you be able to expand any further on any of the particular highlights? And I think probably from your example, Lisa, about the malaria vaccine, would you be able to expand on our role in helping combat this disease?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Jenner Institute has, over the past decade, 15 years, been developing the R21 malaria vaccine that just got WHO approval at the end of last year and commenced rollout this summer. And it's 75% effective in stopping cases of malaria in high endemicity countries, and it's a real success story. It's very cheap. It's about between $2 and $4 a dose, and it requires 3 doses for the primary series with 1 dose a year later. And it's been recommended for use between 5 months and 36-month-old children.
Young children are the main victims of malaria.
It provides lifetime protection. Does it do lifetime protection?
It does not do lifetime protection, and we aren't there yet in terms of follow-up to know exactly how long it does provide protection for. And while you're absolutely right, the young children are the main sufferers in terms of malaria, but actually in terms of eradication, we can't forget about adults who have parasites in their blood that are accessible to mosquitoes to then continue the life cycle.
It's ensuring that children can live, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's been some really other interesting... So I'm a kind of neglected disease person as well, and absolutely the opportunity to study these really weird, quite quirky diseases in a lab space has meant that we've got some really interesting other things in science. And we visited Liverpool very recently. Would you be able to expand on the device that can detect the filariasis in the arm, and just sort of how that platform...
Sorry, which... what specific technology? Sorry, I missed that.
So it's a platform that's basically going to be like a little watch, and it can detect the filariasis in the lymphatic system. But that technology can then help with diabetes and other diseases that we may well all experience.
So I think there's a in medicine generally, there's this trend to actually wearable devices. We've all got heart rate monitors on at the moment that actually can detect. And, diabetes is a great example. We're starting to see those now being used and filariasis is a really good example. But I think I would expand slightly, and actually, it's partly what Lisa was just saying. I think it's not just in malaria that we've made huge, or malaria vaccines, but the UK has been a world leader in malaria control generally, and that's a combination of vaccines. It's a combination of partnerships with technology companies to develop insecticides that are now effective where we've got resistance. It's partnerships with drug companies, GSK, for example, for anti-malarial drugs. It's a partnership with the countries themselves on how do you get those nets out to the populations that need it. And so I think there's a huge amount of both kind of standard medicine and technological medicine that the UK really is leading in, and malaria is a really good example of that.
In 17 countries across the globe, we've seen malaria eradicated. We can eradicate it globally, do you think? With all these new tools, techniques?
The critical thing, I think, is that we will need multiple tools. The vaccine is great, but we'll need lots of other things alongside it. I think we'll struggle to completely eradicate it from countries where we've got very intense transmission. There are some countries where a child is getting infected by every day. Yeah. And even if you reduce that by 99%, you're still going to have the chance of infection. So I think it'll be quite a long time before we get rid of it in every country, but we can certainly eradicate it in many more countries than we have done at the moment.
Or deaths from malaria.
Yeah, absolutely. And deaths have gone down by half since by the beginning of the century.
That in itself is a fantastic good news story. Just 2 points. Is it about one vaccine, or is it a number of vaccines for the different types of malaria that there are? And we hear a lot about climate change, and climate change impacts disease progression and disease prevalence. Are there concerns that climate change will lead to malaria being present in parts of the world that it hasn't been, such as Europe, for example?
Got it.
At least to take the vaccine, certainly, yes.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, climate change means that the available areas that mosquitoes can live will increase. And it wasn't that long ago that Europe did have a lot of malaria, and there was widespread DDT spraying that helped us enormously. But yeah, absolutely, there's a large chance that it could come back as well. There's increased prevalence of the Anopheles stevensii mosquito, and this is much more adapted to urban living. So this is a real problem, and the WHO is really worried about the spread of that mosquito, which is not just biting at dusk when people are going to bed and might be protected by mosquito nets.
Steve?
Can I just take that into respect? I think the climate crisis will affect all neglected tropical diseases. if you look at predictions for pretty much all of them, we're going to see generally increased rates. And it's complex, because malaria will go down in some areas and up in some areas. So it's complex, but we're going to see increased rates. And a really good example of that is the dengue that we are now starting to see affecting southern Europe. We don't have to have much higher temperatures in the UK before we start to see transmission of dengue fever in the UK. That's a neglected disease that is going to be on our shores, I suspect, within 20 years' time, unless we do something radically. It's like, unless you do something radically about the climate crisis. So I think this is going to change the face of neglected tropical diseases. If you had to ask me, what am I most worried about, is that climate change has the ability to undo all of the advances we've made in the last 25 years.
I suppose it's also saying that their neglect will change as they become closer to those countries which have greater resources in this area. Steve?
You led exactly into my question around other disease areas that will become more prevalent, may become more prevalent in Europe, including dengue and then chikungunya and others. How well prepared do you think we are in the UK, let's say, to identify, to contain, to treat these areas?
Well, there's a great deal of surveillance, and the critical thing for those diseases that you've mentioned are actually, have we got the right mosquitoes? The spread has been because the mosquitoes that carry those diseases are spread upwards as temperatures increase. So there's a lot of surveillance, and I think the key to that is as those vectors become available, as those mosquitoes become available in the UK, or they are present in the UK rather, then we need to control them and get rid of them at the earliest availability or earliest point. In terms of treatment and management, then it will depend on how much of a problem that will be. But I think we probably will be able to control those for the UK perspective.
Yeah, I just want to ask about research into some of the kind of medieval hits that used to impact on us that are effectively eminently eradicable but aren't in parts of the world. So leprosy, cholera, those kind of diseases. And are the barriers purely kind of practical? But B, is the research into some of those previously big killers here and in other parts of the world, which might make the eradication more efficient in parts of the world where delivery is difficult?
Shall I start then? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think, let's take leprosy for example. Leprosy figures have gone down fundamentally over the last kind of 20 years. There are still 200,000 cases per year around the world.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, we know what we need to do with leprosy in terms of we can treat it, albeit not easily, and but it's actually finding new cases, and it's fundamentally a problem of the health systems. And a lot of these, and it's the same to a certain extent with cholera, this is about poverty-driven disease. And unless you change economic conditions, you're still going to struggle to control this. Cholera is essentially, really effectively, a hygiene issue. And there are great new vaccines emerging out of Oxford, but it's a hygiene issue. One of the really important things I think is that...
On cholera, you said there are new vaccines.
There are new vaccines that, emerging out of Oxford, and there are decent vaccines that are becoming available. But again, you have to deliver those.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, it's economic growth that will make a big difference to a lot of those diseases. And there's a really important, I think, connection between reducing disease and economic growth. So if you look at the estimations for what it does to an economy, if you eradicate malaria, for example, it's phenomenal in terms of the economic growth of that country. And so we are in this mixture where we need to actually treat disease to actually improve the economic status of a country that will then actually prevent even further diseases occurring.
Yeah.
I would say that they go hand in hand, and it's although I'm a vaccinologist and I'm really a proponent of vaccines, I don't think that that's the fix for everything. It is much more of a holistic kind of public health fix that we need. And as David was saying, it's not just that they're associated with poverty and you increase the economic growth potential of a country and therefore disease eradication will follow. I think it's also the stability of the country, and cholera is a hygiene issue in areas where there's not good sanitation, in areas where there are refugees, in war-torn areas.
Yes.
This is where those diseases really come to the fore, and I don't think that a vaccine in that kind of environment is going to help.
I think the one point, sorry, one I just would just make was the UK has been amazingly good in thinking about this from the poverty perspective. And that's where we have had, I think, we are the global leader in thinking about these diseases that affect poor people and thinking about that holistic approach, rather than if you say there's going to be a drug or a vaccine or something, a technology that will solve this. On its own, they don't work.
Thank you, David. That's very good to hear. I'm going to bring in Emily here on ODA, and then we'll go to Steve on HIV.
So just picking up on both of your points, obviously the UK has previously led the way in terms of overseas assistance and research into health, but our health spend is now 20 million less. Well, in 2023 was 20 million less than it was in 2010 and half the percentage of our ODA spend. What kind of impact do you think that both the health ODA spend and the total ODA spend decreasing has on our efforts to eradicate both the disease and research, but also impacting the poverty that you were talking about that's driving some of these diseases?
So there's no doubt at all that the official development assistance cuts that we saw in COVID were a major problem in terms of the progress we'd made in a number of diseases, and we've seen that play out. It was also a major problem in terms of actually our UK reputation, because partnerships that have been built up over 25 years were lost within 2 months. And so I think that undoubtedly we, as a country, we need to get back a little bit some of that respect we had as a consequence of that. I think that one of the important things about the ODA funding is that we have used it, I think, very wisely, and particularly the research element of that, to actually inform our development assistance generally. So if you get the research right, you know how you spend the rest of your budget wisely. And I think that's where we've been very good. And I think it's really important that we maintain that. And to a certain extent, the proportion of ODA on research has been maintained despite the total going down. Having said that, if you look at all the estimates in reduction, it means we are less able to contribute, particularly to those multilaterals. And I think we haven't spoken about that, but contributions to Gavi, to the Global Fund, to the product development partnerships, which have brought in new drugs such as DNDi, MMV, are a really critical part in which we have, a critical way in which we as a country have reduced diseases. And our ODA reduction means that we can't spend on much of those multilaterals either. We're not actually giving as much to Gavi as we should do. We're not doing as much with the Global Fund as we should do. And that's why I would be pushing very hard for it to go back to 0.7, as you might imagine.
Well, no, and you rightly recognise Ravi and the Global Fund, which are UK innovations.
Absolutely. And DNDi, all of those have really, those PDPs have been absolutely pushed. IVCC, vector control. They are coming from UK initiatives.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, Steve, you're going to lead for us on HIV and AIDS.
Great, thank you, and thanks for your contribution so far. So, Professor Lalloo, obviously, within the space of my lifetime, 40 years, we've gone from discovering a disease that we didn't understand at all to effectively having an amazing path to no new transmissions by 2030, which is an astonishing achievement, and we are sort of world leaders, I think, in this country around this. So a combination of testing, treatment, meaning if you're undetectable, you cannot transmit the disease, and then PrEP, obviously being an enormously useful tool over recent years as well. So from your perspective, what do you think is the most sort of important recent advance in HIV and AIDS prevention and treatment?
I think I'd first to say, if we look back, in 20 years' time, we'll look back on antiretroviral rollout in Africa and think it's one of the most amazing things we've done, I think, as a medical, as a human community. It's been phenomenal, the ability to go from no people being treated to the large number that are being treated now. And as a clinician, when I went around wards in Africa 20 years ago, all you saw were dying patients. And now you're seeing people HIV infected and getting on normal lives. So it's transformed. There is no doubt at all that we've reduced deaths, we've reduced the number of new infections, but we're not going to stop transmission by 2030. That's not going to happen, and there are still a number of reasons why, areas where we need to improve. And one of the problems is not just getting people on treatment, it's getting on treatment quickly enough. So early diagnosis and self-testing, again, pushed very much by the UK, has been a really important part in getting early diagnosis. But it's maintaining people on treatment. It's around having those health systems that maintain people on treatment. And then I think prevention is a really interesting area. You will have heard about this concept called PrEP, which is giving people drugs or injections to prevent HIV in those at highest risk. And there have been some fantastic innovations recently. One of the latest drugs in a trial had no new infections in people at high risk of HIV over a year or year and a half of follow-up. So there are, I think, some very interesting prevention interventions that, if they become affordable and available, then will make a huge difference, in addition to targeting the really important populations, the key populations where HIV is a big problem.
You mentioned some of the injectables. I assume that those are some of the new treatments you're talking about.
Yes, so they can be used for treatment or prevention. And the great thing about that, and in a health system where you may have to travel for 30 miles to get to a health clinic, something that doesn't mean you have to go back and get tablets every 3 months is a real advance. So if you've got those things that you give, those injectables you can give less often, that really makes things much easier for patients.
And CAB-LA is not being brought onto the NHS, is that right? So
again, sorry?
CAB-LA, which is one of the injectables.
So the current situation is that NICE wanted more economic data on that before they felt that it reached their threshold for for the cost benefit, as it does with all actual interventions. So I think, as I understand it, that was an interim judgment, and that assessment is still going on.
And then we'll just move on to, I think it's lenacapavir.
Yes.
Thank you. And then we'll bring it together on both of those. So how fast do you think that will come to market? Because it's still in trials, I think, at the moment.
It is in trials. There have now been 2 trials, one in women, one in a much broader population, that shows enormous benefit, between 100% and 98 to 100% success. I think that is likely to come to market very rapidly. As I understand it, most of the data that's needed for the dossier is there, or will be there very soon. Again, the questions will be cost and accessibility, as it always is with a new drug, but both to the UK and to the LOIC population.
Right. And then are they, would you characterise them as vaccines, or are they
No, they are very definitely drugs that we can give this. There are some new antibody technologies that are looking quite promising for prevention as well, but those are a little bit further down the line.
But the main benefit of these is that you have to take them have to inject them far less often than taking the pill, obviously.
So most HIV kind of preventative medication at the moment is just taking a pill every day. These can be given either every 2 months or, in fact, every 6 months, and that means people don't forget that. And particularly in countries where there's a lot of stigma around HIV, it means it's not obvious. If you've got an injection twice a year, then no one notices. If you're taking a tablet every day, people say, why are you doing that? You must be HIV positive, or you must be at risk of HIV positive, maybe you're promiscuous. Those kind of stigmas are still a big issue for many of the diseases we're talking about.
And then, so would you characterise them as quite important tools to getting to zero transmission, whether 2030 or
yes, they're one or two, but it's like malaria. We need everything together. There is no magic bullet. Whatever Bill Gates tells you, technology is not the answer. It has to be an integrated approach.
Technology is often the answer.
But together, but the best technology is hopeless if you don't deliver it to the population that need it. And so often, we know the answer, and we know we have the tools, we just can't get them to the populations that need it.
And then obviously opt-out testing has been quite an important tool as well, and that's been rolled out. It started in the previous government and rolled out under this government to 91 other A&Es, I think. Is that quite an important tool as well, do you think?
Yes, if we take a UK perspective, the reality is I think that we should be normalising HIV testing like any other test. And I think that's happening to a great extent now. The opt-out testing, I think, has been in many places, have been doing it, if you like, slightly unofficially anyway. And it's just, I think, good clinical practice now. If you have anyone with a symptom or sign that could be vaguely related to HIV, the sooner you make that diagnosis, the greater the chance of rapid treatment.
And then just before we move on to a final couple of questions around the global position,
Yes.
You said that 2030 is just not possible. What do you think are the main barriers to that? And how do you think what might we need extra to either meet that date or a
I think it's getting at the populations that are still not accessing care and making sure that they can access care and they can access care rapidly enough. So if you reduce the time from somebody being infected to making their diagnosis, then the time at which they can infect others is reduced, obviously. And it's that time that is one of the major things that we need to do at this stage.
Great, thank you. And then my final question is just around what can the UK do with lower income countries? We talked about Gavi in the previous section. What can we do to support lower income countries to stop HIV transmissions? What aren't we doing at the moment that we should be doing more of?
I think we're probably doing most things. I think we should be doing more of it. And I think that's the whole spectrum. I think absolutely supporting Gavi or supporting the Global Fund here, that's particularly important. But also continue the research that actually both develops these new approaches and these new drugs and the research on how you get them to the populations that need them.
Thank you very much, Steve. And just on that last point, so how would you characterise the UK role in supporting and developing both, if you like, the therapeutics and the vaccines and delivering them across the world? What's the UK doing? Are we doing well? Are we making significant contribution?
Let Lisa talk about vaccines and I'll come to the drugs.
So in terms of what we're doing and how the UK government is funding that, I am not best placed to answer that, I'm afraid.
Okay. So I think, in terms of taking the second bit first, getting into the people, the Gavi is the major instrument by which we are helping to get vaccines available to populations that need them. And that's why I think Gavi support is so important. Mm-hmm. In terms of developing vaccines, absolutely, the UK is undoubtedly a world leader in vaccines, and Oxford is a world leader within the UK at a wide range of vaccine technologies. And as we saw in the pandemic, the ability of us to turn on vaccines very rapidly was the expertise. Ironically, we predicted the UK population by investment and got into vaccines for LMICs. And again, we should not...
Sorry?
So we protected the UK population with our COVID vaccine because of investment that had predominantly gone into vaccines for non-UK populations.
Low-income countries.
For low and middle-income countries, sorry.
And
we should not forget that connection, that investment in global health and those conditions of people over there is actually quite an important part of protecting the UK public health as well.
Great point, well made.
And so the drugs, the UK, the pharma industry and the engagement of UK academics, academic institutions with pharma, I think is unparalleled in joint solutions. Filariasis, elephantiasis, got a donation of 940 million pounds worth of drugs from Merck. And so that partnership is really important to our role.
I know that Kit and Alison very quickly...
I just had a final question for Dr. Stockdale. I know that Jenna was instrumental in the COVID vaccine. Presumably there's like a canteen at the Jenna, right, where you all mill around and different research groups get together. Which group are you all talking about is going to be the next big thing coming out of the Jenna? It might be you, right? But what's the next big thing that we can expect coming out of this amazing institute?
Mm.
The malaria vaccine group are doing still amazing things. So when you talk about malaria, it's not just one parasite that you need to worry about. So there's also Vivax, which is a latent form of malaria. We're working towards a vaccine on that. As well, when you do talk about the main form of malaria parasite, we, with our 75% effective vaccine, we're just focusing on the first life cycle stage. If there are any parasites that evade that, then they can come out in different life stages of the parasite. And there's another group at Oxford University who have just come out with a paper with very good efficacy on a blood stage vaccine as well. So the idea is that not only can you have these individual vaccines against different forms of the parasite and different life cycles, you can form them into potentially one vaccine that will help against all of those life cycle stages and different forms of the parasite.
Fantastic.
That's what all the talk is about in the canteen.
That's what the talk is about in the canteen.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. Very good.
A very broad lot there,
Alison, did you have a...
my head shot up when you were talking about the amount of funding that's given to different diseases, and I just was wondering about fungal diseases, which, if I cast my mind back, as a group, is a bigger killer than even malaria.
Which diseases?
Fungal diseases.
Fungal, yes.
So how is the funding going down that route, and are there any major fungal diseases we need to be thinking about?
I'm not sure I would say there is a bigger killer of malaria, but they certainly are significant. I think there's two elements to that. There are the fungal diseases that have been typically associated with HIV-infected populations, so patients whose immune system doesn't work very well at a much greater risk of fungal infections generally. And so there has been a fair deal of cryptococcal disease is a really good example of that. This is a fungus that causes a meningitis in patients, particularly with advanced HIV. The UK has essentially, over a period of 20 years, done a whole load of trials that have now got to the point where you can give a single dose of a treatment, and that's revolutionising the treatment of this disease, particularly in low-resource settings. So I think that I think we're doing reasonably well on that, and there has been funding available for those. Where we see the challenges are some of the more chronic fungal diseases, and these are things like mycetoma, which are fungal diseases that get into the foot via the soil, and then they cause swelling and a bit like elephantiasis and really severe lesions. Those have just only become recognised as a neglected tropical disease, and I think we are probably way behind the curve in actually researching to those areas. But the very severe systemically life-threatening diseases, I think we've done reasonably well with.
That's good news.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Professor Lalloo and Dr. Stockdale. You have brought hope, I think, in terms of the fantastic and innovative research and development, and as we've talked about, the steps, the support that the UK is offering in the diffusion of new treatments and therapeutics, and the fact that there are 250 million people suffering from malaria cases every year, and 40 million living with HIV/AIDS, and millions more with other neglected tropical diseases. That's a great testament to the work that you're doing and the work the UK is doing, and the points made that these diseases may be coming closer to our own environments, and that we gain as a country from the work that is being done on neglected tropical diseases, I think has made an impression on the committee. So thank you very much, and we'll now suspend for a couple of minutes. Order. Good morning and order. Good morning and thanks for joining us for the second part of this one-off session, Christmas session in looking at eradicating diseases. We're now going to move on to dementia and Parkinson, and I'd just like to to welcome Professor Siddharthan Chandran and Dr. Simon Stott, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly before I ask Tom to start the committee's questioning.
So I'm director of the UK Dementia Research Institute. This is a national MRC institute distributed across 6 leading universities of this country in Scotland, England and Wales. Our mission is through research to transform the outlook for people living with or at risk of neurodegenerative disorders and dementias. So that will be from Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease and so on.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Stott?
Yes, good morning and thank you very much for the opportunity to present evidence today. So I'm the Director of Research at Cure Parkinson's. We were founded in 2005 by 4 gentlemen who were wanting to cure the condition rather than have better care. And we focused solely on finding disease-modifying therapies for Parkinson's, treatments that will slow down or stop or reverse the condition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for giving your time and joining us today. Tom?
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you. First question that I've got really is just sort of for yourself, Professor Chandran, what steps are being taken to sort of tackle dementia, and principally what progress are we seeing, and how does that vary depending on the types of dementia? I appreciate that's quite a big and broad-ranging question.
It's an important question. It might help for us to frame dementia. What is dementia? So dementia itself is not a disease. It describes it's an umbrella term. It describes a group of conditions that cause progressive decline in brain function. And then that has a range of symptoms that we're familiar with, sadly. Loss of memory, problems with language understanding, changes in personality behavior, movement, and so on. What all dementias-related conditions share are 3 things. They're all age-dependent, they're progressive and incurable. There's a lot of it, we'll come back to that. The second is, as the name would imply, neurodegenerative. They're defined pathologically by loss of nerve cells, neurodegeneration. But they're also defined by the accumulation of one or more handful of toxic proteins. The details don't matter, but the principle does. The type of disease that you have reflects which nerve cells goes wrong and which protein is involved. So, for example, Alzheimer's, the most common dementia, cause of dementia, nerve cells start to go wrong in that part of the brain that controls memory, but it's due to 2 key proteins. You'd have heard of them, amyloid and tau.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Parkinson's, area that goes wrong, brain cells in the particular midbrain of the brain, dopamine cells. The protein's called synuclein. Motor neuron disease, motor nerves, proteins called TDP, and so on. The reason that's important is because underlying all of this are common biological features. So, for example, inflammation of the brain is common. The way the brain handles proteins, its turnover, its generation and then its clearance when that goes wrong. And what that means is if you have interventions that deal with the protein problem or the inflammation problem, it is relevant for a range of conditions, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And the UK Dementia Research Institute works across all of these neurodegenerative disorders because what we're driven by is delivering people who've got these conditions. What do they need? I'm still a practicing neurologist. I work in NHS Lothian. I was on call this weekend. Patients aren't interested in which institute or which doctor's doing what. What they want is fast, accurate diagnosis and a route into a streamlined pathway which will begin to give them personalised, tailored intervention. That's what they want. So if you want to do that, you've got to invest in the discovery science. The only way we're going to make a difference is better understanding and unpicking the complexity of the disease.
Can I just ask a point of clarification there? You said that they were all dementia, all age-dependent. All dementia diseases were age-dependent.
The vast majority of...
So obviously we've heard of early onset examples. I just want to clarify.
Okay. So So the vast majority of dementias are age-related, the older we get, okay?
Yeah.
So if you just look at the numbers, if you go from 1 in 600 odd at the age of 60 to 65 through to 1 in 6 when you're over 85.
Right.
The exception to the rule, so the most of these conditions are what we call complex disorders, sporadic. There isn't a single faulty gene that causes it. But there are others which are purely genetically driven, where one dodgy gene causes it. And when that happens, it tends to occur earlier, in 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s. But that can shed a light on the common problem, because apart from it coming faster, the basic underlying biology is common.
That's very interesting, and just so that we know where the prevalence of these terrible diseases is. Tom?
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously, we've seen in recent months and this year a number of drugs that have come available that would be helpful in treating and stopping the sort of progression of dementias. I mean, is your view that these should be prescribed on the NHS and should be offered? And I suppose the other question that I have on that is, obviously, if we're wanting to treat people, obviously it's really important to sort of identify those people who might be at risk of developing dementia. So what more work needs to be done on screening? And obviously if we can identify those people and delay onset at an earlier phase, it's much better than when you've already seen quite severe side effects.
You should come and write my grants. So you've asked quite a lot. I'll just go through that. The first thing to say is, as an adult neurologist, having been at medical school deep into the last century, we're at a tipping point for neurodegenerative disorders and dementias. This really is a story where there's change. It's at a point of inflection. Okay? The reason for that is because of decades of discovery science, which is now beginning to surface. The UK has had an important role in that and continues to. The question is, can we be absolutely in the box seat with the change that's coming? Okay? So you've asked me two things really around prevention, potentially screening, and current treatments. So there are indeed some current treatments, and you'll all be familiar with MHRA's announcement around two drugs, but they belong to the amyloid class of drugs. I've already referenced that as one of the proteins. A few points to be made here, first of all, and again, this is good news for the UK. The entire amyloid hypothesis originated from the UK, and the person behind that is a guy called John Hardy, who's part of the Dementia Research Institute. Okay? The second is, it's very important because what these drugs show for the first time, and that's why it is genuinely transformative, that the disease, the problem is tractable. It has shown that you can shift the signal, you can shift the dial. You might not be able to shift it enough, but you can shift it, and it's the beginning of something rather than the end of something. The moment you show you can shift it, it's tractable, you then get a tsunami of investment from pharma, industry, governments. So then the question is whether it is appropriate for the population today. And that, as we know, it takes two decisions, MHRA, but then there's a cost effectiveness evaluation by NICE. Okay? The initial view was no, but they're reviewing that. But I think it's very important to make the following point. Again, when I was at medical school, conditions like multiple sclerosis there were no treatments. But it began with beta interferons. Today, in under 20 years, it's undergone a transformation. The newly diagnosed person with multiple sclerosis, and I saw two of them yesterday, have 15 licensed drugs, all multi-billion-dollar. Okay? And Steve, you mentioned earlier about HIV and the spectacular advances over 40 years. But it's 40 years. Okay? And that's when you know what the problem is. You know what the cause is, the virus. So the brain degenerative disorders, there's a reason they're a bit further behind, but we're absolutely at a tipping point. Prevention. One of the things that we've been able to do, again, in the Dementia Research Institute, but I've got to emphasize this is partnership working across with NIHR, industry, many other people, the NHS. We're now harnessing technologies, other British assets like cohorts, AI. There's some brilliant research by a person called Cynthia Sandel, which showed that using wearables and other data, You can predict Parkinson's, which we'll hear more about, in 5 to 7 years before it starts. There are also other ways of beginning to predict people at high risk. And the moment you have that, you can then begin to think of screening for interventions. One day, could there be the equivalent of the cholesterol tablet, but for healthy brain aging? The other major breakthrough, apart from disease-modifying therapies, and it's all about metrology. It's a bit dull, but you've got to be able to measure stuff. So imagine if there was a blood test, not a complicated hospital visit with the expensive scan and the needle in your back, but a simple blood test, equivalent to a blood test telling you you've got diabetes. Now imagine there was a blood test which gave you a brain score. But that blood test is here now. Okay? And that again is led by a global leader called Henrik Zetterberg, who's based here at the UK Dementia Research Institute. He also highlights when you've got brilliant research institutes, you recruit people internationally. He was from Gothenburg and UCL. So I think the future is about prevention, identifying people at high risk. You could think one day of screening, accurate, rapid diagnosis today, so when you go to the GP, the equivalent of a blood test, and maybe something off your phone, and then the beginnings of targeted, personalised treatments. It's a journey, but we're on that.
Thank you, Professor Chandran. That's very inspiring. I think the comparison with HIV/AIDS is well made. The progress that's been made, but also that the HIV/AIDS diagnosis initially was seen as a death sentence, and that increased both the shame and also the reluctance of testing. Now dementia is little understood by many of those who fear it most, and you're holding out a kind of a pathway to both understanding it, diagnosing it, and critically treating it.
Yeah. One other thing I might add about HIV and AIDS, which is very important. When we think about these conditions and we think about treatments, and you've asked me, we think about single interventions. These are complicated diseases. It's not going to be single interventions. The reason we had breakthroughs in cancer is combination chemotherapy. HIV treatment is combination. The future for these conditions will be prediction where appropriate, rapid, accurate diagnosis, and then combinatorial treatment bespoke to the individual, dependent on stage and subtype, and will change dependent on where they are. That is where we'll get to. The question is, how do we ensure that the UK retains its leadership position end to end, from discovery, mechanistic science, through to delivery and translation? That's the challenge.
Thank you very much. Now I know that Alison would like to come in, and then Lauren and Stephen. Okay, great. Alison, we'll start with you.
Can I challenge you on how one of the reasons why we may not be as far ahead as example for HIV? I do have a great concern that we have a very narrow focus on familial Alzheimer's mouse models, particularly the Swedish twin double mutation.
Yes.
And also a query about the focus on the amyloid beta hyper. For me, just so that you know, that was my PhD topic.
No pressure then.
And it concerned me. My job was to develop an AI model to predict the various mutations of all the amyloid proteins that can occur. So there's more than just tau and A beta in
sorry, Alison, could you speak into the mic?
Very quick, sorry. So, my question is, do you feel that we are inhibiting our research by this heavy focus on familial Alzheimer's mouse models and models like that, and on the A-beta hypothesis, and that we need to broaden our view and our research base?
In a nutshell, I think your instincts and what you're covering is correct. But let me just address a couple of things, first of all. Within the Alzheimer's field, first of all, DRI, dementia research, covers a range of conditions. The synucleinopathies, Parkinson's, small vessel vascular dementia, which is 20%, TDP-43, MND, right? Now, you will know better than I suspect, in terms of amyloid, and for the rest of the committee, there are what used to be called the Taoists and the Baptists. So there's the crowd who believe in amyloid, there's the crowd who believe in tau.
Tau?
Yeah, because this is the other protein. There's the tau, so hence the Taoist and the Baptist, beta amyloid protein.
Can you just describe what the schism is for those who are not?
The schism is what you, Alison. What we know is these diseases, including amyloid, there are pathological signatures, and two of the pathological signatures in Alzheimer's are these proteins. One's called amyloid, and one's called tau.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And then there's a debate as to are these causal?
Yes,
or are they some sort of consequence epiphenomenon, right? Yes. Now, if John Hardy was here, right, he would argue with a lot of evidence that there's a strong evidence that amyloid is causal. Whether it's causal for the whole way, there's a distinction between causing the initiation of something and then something else that's necessary to set the fire alight, but you need something else to fan the fire, okay? Right. But to come back to your wider question, just to be clear, one of the reasons I am hopeful and the field is hopeful for the future is because we have a greater range of models to study human disease. In the end, if you want to solve human disease, you've got to study people at scale. Okay? And you've got to use people as your primary, if you like, research tool. This is again why the UK, if we get it right, would be very strong, because we have a unitary healthcare system. We've got these amazing cohorts. If you link that to biomarkers, if you link that to human stem cell research, which is my own area of research, you can start to model human disease using human systems. The role for animal research is necessary, but it's limited. The shift has been into human-anchored research. That is where the DRI is.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I think it was, I think Kit, it was Adam, we haven't spoken for Adam, Kit, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And, thank you for this session. It's been really informative. I just want to drill down on the kind of research science. You've talked, Professor, extensively about the importance of discovery science here. You said that we're at a tipping point, potentially. Talked really interestingly about multiple sclerosis. It's something that I care about a lot. I've got a very close family member who has an MS diagnosis and actually has been profoundly positively affected by the medications that he's taking as a result in the past couple of years. But focusing on kind of today's theme of positivity and forward outlook, just like your thoughts on what you think are the kind of big breakthroughs and innovations that are on the horizon and when we can expect to start to see some of these things coming forward.
First of all, I think some of those breaks are already happening. But there are two other ways we might think about that. In the end, our job is to transform people's lives. Okay? So we need to address what people want. We need to democratize things. We need to make any breakthroughs relevant to people wherever they are, whoever they are. Poorer people, people from ethnic minorities, are less well served by advances. They also participate less in research studies. We need to fix all of that. The UK can. What we need to do as a country in the UK DRI is make UK the destination of choice for investment from industry to ensure and cement two of our country's priorities: maintaining health, brain health in an ageing society, and to cement our role as a global leader in life science dementia research and drive inward investment. So if I give you the UK Dementia Research Institute as an example, terrific investment from the MRC and others. That's leveraged 2.5 times in a short time, 7-8 years. Now, if you put 100 quid in your bank and in 7 years it was 250 quid, you'd think that's a result. It's also driven company creation. So there's several, but one stands out. Colleague Chris Shaw, Eviada Bio, gene therapies for rare disorders, £80 million of investment in the last 5 years. There's also technology, AI-driven, to improve people's lives at home, prevent them going to hospital. So that leftward shift of healthcare, prevention, prediction, protection, keeping out hospital, community-delivered, compatible with O'Shaughnessy. 1 in 6 hospital beds are occupied by people with dementia and related neurodegenerative disorders. A lot of that is due to infections. We can now monitor that, prevent that at home, never get into hospital. Right? So, and the other reason is the science, the discovery science. Notwithstanding the comments, the very recent comments about amyloid, nonetheless, it shows that the problem is potentially soluble. There are many, many serious trials on the way. There are many trials that we as a country could and should lead. This business of having a blood test so that your GP can make a diagnosis and put you on the right pathway without going to the hospital has to be right. The idea then we might be able to identify anybody age over 50 at high risk, targeted interventions, even if it's going after their cholesterol, blood pressure, diabetes, which we know can drive. These things are all here now. Next 10, 20 years, if I was sitting here, we'll be talking a very different game. The change is coming. The key question isn't whether change will happen. It will happen. The question is whether Britain will be in the vanguard and leading it, or a late adopter. We need to be in the peloton and right at the front.
One quick question. I think we completely agree with that. I'm most certain I speak for all of my colleagues on that front. What do you see as the kind of major barriers in where we're at now and what you've just described?
I hope you got a sense of hope from me and optimism. We should, as a country, be more confident about this. Okay, so the reason is this: if we can triangulate the following: world-class science, we have that. World-class universities, we have 4 of the top 10. If we can triangulate that with the NHS, still brilliant unitary healthcare provider, around a challenge-led investment, which is what the Dementia Research Neurodegenerative Institute is, we'd be unstoppable. So in terms of if I had policy asks, one is data. You'd have heard about data in this committee. Data is in many ways the lifeblood of research and care. Okay? What we need is to understand that health data is a national critical infrastructure. And we need to organise it, curate it, put in place proportionate governance, never compromise primacy of public benefit. But if you get that right, the Sudlow Review covered a lot of this, get that right, you can then drive much better research, much better care. There is a convergence of care and research. Good care cannot be separate from good research. Data saves lives, data improves them. So that's one.
Thank you, Professor Chandran, and that's that's an appeal that we are very cognizant of. I'm going to move on to Parkinson now, because the time is running out. But please put your questions if we have time after it. So, Emily, you had questions on Parkinson's.
Dr. Stott. So Parkinson's is an issue very close to my heart. My father has Parkinson's. And we know that we're looking at potentially a doubling in the next 50 years. So I wanted you to give us some hope about where you saw some of the breakthroughs, also some of the breakthroughs that we've seen in the last 5-10 years, which have been incredible as well, and what Britain's role in that has been.
So we could talk about the improvements in the development of symptomatic treatments, but given my focus, I'd prefer to talk more towards the disease-modifying therapies. Any curative treatment for Parkinson's is going to require 3 things. Number 1, a disease-halting mechanism. Number 2, some sort of neuroprotective approach. And number 3, some form of restorative therapy. And what's really, really exciting at the moment for Parkinson's research is that we've got research going across, at the clinical level, going across all 3 of those domains. 20-odd years ago, 1997, in fact, we got the first indications of genetic risk factors for Parkinson's that not necessarily are causal, but infer vulnerability, and that gave us insight into the associated biology. And so for the first 10 years of the century, we were looking at what is that biology and what is it doing inside cells. The second 10 years, we were looking at building up assays for analysing this biology and screening of drugs. And now in this third decade, we're in the very exciting phase of actually clinically testing those drugs. And while it might not necessarily... Parkinson's is not a genetic condition. Those variants only affect about 20% of people people in the Parkinson's community. The rest are considered idiopathic or spontaneous. But when we look at the biology associated with those variants. In many cases, it's affected in idiopathic Parkinson's as well. And right now, we have clinical trials ongoing, even in this country, that are looking at, firstly, disease-halting mechanisms. We have Dario Alessi and colleagues in Dundee. They are the best in the world with regards to a protein called LRRK2. And there's a clinical trial focused on LRRK2. Inhibiting this protein, it becomes hyperactive in Parkinson's. We also have neuroprotective approaches. We've recently had Tom Fultonay here at UCL, for example, looking at GLP-1 agonists in Parkinson's. And out in Bristol, we've got research groups looking at neurotrophic factors such as GDNF. Firstly, it was with a direct infusion into the brain, and then now it's looking at a gene therapy approach. And then finally, we've got groups such as in Cambridge, Professor Roger Barker and colleagues who are collaborating with Swedish researchers around stem cell transplantation for Parkinson's, replacing the dopamine cells that have been lost. So it's a really exciting time. It's never a good time to have Parkinson's, but it's a really exciting time for the research focused around halting the condition. And just to add to that, we've also got efforts to actually go prodromal. The Michael J. Fox Foundation, for example, in America are setting up a clinical trial. It's the first of its kind, looking at preventing the condition before it's actually diagnosed. So there's markers such as constipation and sleep disruption that are affected in many people, and they lose a sense of smell, for example. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go on and get Parkinson's, but the Fox Foundation's putting resources towards actually trying to prevent the condition, and they're doing it in the shape of a MAMS platform, which is multi-arm, multi-stage clinical trial platform. This is pre-diagnosis of Parkinson's. And just one final detail with regards to this type of clinical trial. Here in the UK, we're setting up a large MAMS platform, multi-arm, multi-stage, for people living with Parkinson's. It's called the Edmund J. Safra Accelerating Clinical Trials for Parkinson's, and it'll be recruiting next year. And it's not the only MAMS platform. We have MAMS platforms for MS. We have MAMS platforms being set up for dementia and ALS. Siddharthan, sitting beside me here, is the principal investigator on the motor neurons disease SMART MAMS platform. And that's leveraging the resources that we have with the NHS. If we were to try and do these sorts of clinical trials in the US, we'd have to add an extra zero to the funding that's required. And that's one of the major advantages we have here in the UK. I feel like I'm ranting.
No. I think that addresses the first question, and we keep hearing this term about this sort of trifecta. I think you described it as, Professor Chandran, about the NHS and that accessibility to patients' data and clinical trials, and there's been some allusion both with you there's been some illusion that there are some sticking points within that process, or things that we could do better to exploit that world-leading resource that we have in Britain. In terms of Parkinson's, doing this, put your platform for the clinical trial, are you having any difficulties with that? And are there things that could improve that would also go across the other diseases that we're talking about today?
Sorry, the questions with regards to the data?
No, in regards to data, but also in regards to the accessibility to the patient pools and running the trials. At the appropriate times in the disease development.
So at the moment, we've got multiple platforms being set up that are looking at encouraging participation in clinical trials for the Parkinson's community, and data access is an issue with that. Providing the patients with their data firstly, and then giving third-party access to that data.
Can I? Thank you.
I've got one last question. Yes.
So just if we're going to make the advances we should do. We need to change the proportion of people who are given voluntary opportunity to participate in research and trials. Less than 1 in 100 or 5 in 100 for all these conditions, which is crazy given how awful they are. And we need to learn from the experience of cancer. Everybody who's given this diagnosis should walk out of the room with an opportunity to participate in research or trials. That's very important.
Very specific challenge. I'm going to ask you back to
so
we're running out of time.
So one of the interesting developments in Parkinson's is also around technologies and wearable technologies, potentially sort of stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system and others. How do you kind of see that developing, and how do you see the UK's role in that? Are we leading, or are we behind?
So absolutely, we're one of the leaders. There's a lot of really exciting data coming out of Newcastle at the moment. There's a program called Mobilise D, and it's a huge, not just here in the UK, but multinational study being run by Liverpool and Rochester. And one of the advantages of Parkinson's is that it's a motor-related condition primarily, that this is how it manifests itself in the clinic with the motor symptoms, and so we can measure the tremor, we can measure the slowness of movement, and this provides us with potentially with outcomes for clinical trials of these disease-modifying therapies that we're developing at the moment.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'm going to go to Lauren and then Kit, and I think that was all we'll have time for in this session. Thank you so much for your responses.
Thank you, Chair. My question around Parkinson is about the treatment of schizophrenia, and which can lead to Parkinson's. And my uncle has schizophrenia, and we can see the visible Parkinson's that's been developing there. Is that a space and a place that really needs better treatment for schizophrenia to avoid the inevitable Parkinson's? And just sort of, could I just have your views on that, and also about the environmental factors such as sports and the impact later on?
I'll come back to the environmental factors, but I'm not a clinician, I'm just a research scientist, and so I'm going to hand over the clinical question to my comrade here.
I think with schizophrenia and some other mental health disorders, the treatments available, first of all, they're fairly blunt, and we haven't made much progress. They haven't changed largely over 50 years, and that's linked to some of the principles we've rehearsed already. But the major, what I call the major class of phenothiazines, which are still the standard for schizophrenia, a key side effect is Parkinsonism. So it's not quite the same as causing Parkinson's disease in terms of the pathology, but they shut down a lot of the key pathways, because we've talked about this being a problem with the dopamine. These drugs work indirectly by dampening the dopamine, and so they can freeze the patient as well as cause other issues, cognitive. And in some people who have a vulnerability, if you like, unlock that, sadly.
Thank you.
And just with regards to the environmental factors, there is a lot of evidence coming through suggesting the impact of environmental factors such as pesticides or viral infections, etc. We don't really have good clarity on that. It's a very heterogeneous population of people, and the primary correlate with Parkinson's is aging.
Thank you.
Just a final question just on dementia. So when I was at City Hall back in 2014, I was involved in the thinking that eventually resulted in the Institute Research Institute. And at the time, there was a big advantage and a big, I guess, stimulus to its creation. The big stimulus was that industry had collectively up to that point spent about 30 billion on research and got nowhere. And the reason was because they'd all been pursuing broadly the same dead ends without collaborating with each other. So what does that picture look like now? The big advantage that we had also was the UK Dementia Challenge, where there was a strong political lead from then Prime Minister David Cameron around. Dementia, we had Dennis Gillings was our international dementia envoy. Everybody was training to be dementia friends, including me. So there was a big kind of political push, which resulted in the establishment of the institute. It was initially supposed to be international. I assume you're doing lots of international work nevertheless. So how does that look like now? What is the kind of political structure look like? Do we still have a dementia envoy? And what does private sector collaboration look like?
So I think the momentum that you describe has been maintained, if not accelerated. I think that what the Institute has achieved, it's brought together a necklace of UK-wide efforts, because to crack this is a team effort, and it's cross-sector. So there's engineering, technologies, data, neuroscience, clinicians, NHS, partner, and it's doing that. I think one of the ways the Dementia Research Institute might be judged is growing a more integrated, connected UK ecosystem, leading for the world. Industry are absolutely here. We want more of them, and the reason they come is because of the science, the power of the science connected to the opportunities of population-based research, analysis, and then impact. And hence that triangulation of science, universities, NHS. I mean, there are a few wrinkles that need to be ironed out there.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with industry always was is that they don't want to show other people their homework because there's money involved, right?
Yes,
and so they were all researching, as I say, the same dead ends and coming to the same conclusion without necessarily telling each other. The point, I think, back in 2014-15 was to say, look, this is such a challenge for the world. We just can't afford to have this approach. Has that eased now?
Yeah, I think the barriers and the walls have begun to come down. One of the accelerants of that is because of the first glimpse of what's possible with these two drugs, because those two drugs are approved. In some countries they are being prescribed. In this country they could be prescribed privately potentially, but what it means, going back to the MS, is within 10 years you have 10, 20 of these drugs. And they know that the UK is often the test bed to validate and further refine.
So I'm not sure I heard you say, do you think then there's a prospect of us hitting the WHO deadline for curing Alzheimer's by 2030?
No, I think that's unrealistic, going back to HIV. This is a journey. I think we will be, by 2030, have licensed medicines that are beginning to get into this disorder. But it'll take longer, and I think the big wins will be the prevention and the early diagnosis.
Right.
Thank you so much. You have given us a lot to think about, but particularly a lot of hope. I mean, dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, these are diseases which strike terror into many people, and you set out pathways to real change and real hope. We've also all better informed and can take our own positions on the tau amyloid schism in the community.
Taoists and the Baptists.
but it's fantastic to be able to talk positively about the future of dementia and Parkinson's research. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Order. And welcome to this final session of our Christmas inquiry into eradicating diseases. And we're very pleased to be joined by experts in cancer research and development. I'm going to ask Professor KJ Patel and Dr. Julie Torode to introduce themselves, just briefly. First, say your names and your institutions, and then the committee obviously has some questions to put to you. So firstly, can I ask Professor KJ Patel?
I'm KJ Patel. I serve as the Chief Scientist for Cancer Research UK, but I'm also an academic and I'm a professor at Oxford University, where I head an Institute of Molecular Medicine here.
Thank you. And Dr. Torode?
Good morning. My name is Julie Torode. I am Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Institute of Cancer Policy, which is part of King's College London, and a global cancer advocate, particularly interested in improving cancer in low middle-income countries.
Fantastic. Now, as you may know, this morning we have been looking in a Christmas spirit at the good news and eradicating diseases and spreading treatments across the world in different areas, and we're coming to you to talk about cancer eradication. And so, just let me ask Professor KJ, if I can.
Yes.
How close are we to eradicating cancer, and are some types of cancer and which ones are better candidates for eradication than others?
Well, the first good news is that we've made huge inroads into eradicating cancer. And just to give you a couple of very striking examples, where we've known what the initiating cause is, for example, in viral-induced cancers, human papillomavirus and cervical cancer, and thereby the vaccination of that, there's been a dramatic decline in the prevalence of this cancer in populations that have had systemic vaccination programs. And the similar story with hepatitis infection in the liver. So those are very extreme examples where the impact has been very clear and tangible. Another aspect that we must look into is exposures, and the most famous being cigarette smoking. And the decline in cigarette smoking has compositely led to a decline in an important class of lung cancers. However, here lies a paradox, because as lung cancer due to cigarette smoke has declined, we've realized that a new form of cancer has emerged. Well, the term new form would be a mistake. The appearance of cancer in non-smoking individuals has come to the fore. And that's particularly in Southeast Asia and in women. And what this means is that we have to better understand how that comes about and identify what those risk factors are in order to have the same similar impact as we've had with those two other examples that I've given you. So I'm just citing some examples on what was quite a broad question.
Thank you very much. And are there particular scientific advances, for example, you talked about social advances such as the decline in smoking, but are there particular scientific advances such as genetics, machine learning, or personalized medicines which particularly contribute to the eradication of particular cancers?
So it's important to separate the initiation or early cancer from when a person presents with advanced cancer. So let's take the two examples. So in early cancer, we've had a great impact in early detection. So can we detect the cancers earlier by screening and then hence intervene much earlier so that more drastic intervention is not required later on? So the most famous example, of course, being mammography for breast. But if you think of colon and prostate cancer, those screening processes and approaches are there's much more work needs to be done and research to be conducted. But at the same time, we've continued to innovate because the UK is a remarkable place to do cancer research. Simply because of the way we're funded from the charities as well as from the government and also the institutions we have. So one of the important recent innovations that we brought are the early screening of esophageal cancer by the by the swallowing of a sponge, which when pulled back will trap cancer cells, which you can then detect. Very similar to the cervical smear. Now, this is undergoing a large trial right now, and we'll know whether it confers a benefit. So that's one example in play. Well, what may happen into the future in this space is vaccination. So it isn't implausible to think that because in a way, a cancer is a self-parasite, but you have to have an alteration of self in order for that cell to become cancerous. That means that a cancer cell has an imprint of foreignness to it. And in principle, the immune system should be able to see it. So if you're able to identify that foreignness, then we might be able to harness vaccination against that in order to eradicate cancers. Now, obviously, this works in animal models, but needs to be rolled out in humans. And there's been a lot of press recently about cancer vaccination. So that's the early detection of cancers sphere. The other element, which is what happens when you present with cancer, which is advanced. Now, there's been dramatic impact here. When I started as a doctor, if you had a colon colon or breast cancer, which had spread, your mortality was you would count it within a year, possibly 6 months. It's not unusual for people to live up to several years, and that is because of targeted treatment, identifying drugs that will attack the altered gene products that are present in these cancers. But these treatments do not afford a cure, but they improve both the quality and the length of lifespan. The flip side is this is an extremely expensive modality of treatment. And there's an important question here, which is what happens with, as we go into a space of personalized medicine with these bespoke therapies, what's the cost that's going to be involved? The final point I'd make is that it's not conceivable to think that you'd ever eradicate cancer. Cancer occurs in all kingdoms of life, and it's an inevitable process of aging in the human population. So actually, the burden of cancer in our populations will increase as the demographics change, and I think the emphasis should be in reducing your risk of developing it, in early detection, and then possibly in the later phase of more targeted advanced therapy.
Thank you, and I think that's a good, it's both giving us hope in terms of the different areas of progress that you've mentioned, and also realistically the difficulty in actually eradicating it. But what we're talking about really is the impact it has on well-being, and if by the combinations that you're talking about of vaccination, early detection, personalized treatment, we can certainly go, it sounds like we can certainly go a long way in reducing the terrible toll that cancer takes on so many people's lives. Now I'm going to ask, we have the pleasure of welcoming Lalloo Moran, who is the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, and I'm going to ask, she's guesting on our committee, and I'm going to ask you to put some questions, Lalloo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here today. So I'll be focusing, as you might imagine, on a little bit the here and now, and how we can get the NHS to really embrace these innovations. So perhaps I could start with a relatively broad question to both of you. From where you sit, what are the greatest barriers to the NHS adopting many of the innovations that Professor Patel, you outlined, and others besides? Perhaps I could start with Dr. Torode.
Thank you. I think there are two aspects. One is the health system itself. In order to make sure we find a patient early enough, but also that early detection is linked to the right decision on treatment, and completion of treatment is so important. And so that means that the referral system needs to work, the supportive care around patients needs to work. And the other is the social system. A lot of people still do not know enough about the opportunity to reduce your own cancer risk, about the opportunity to detect early and the life-saving opportunities of detecting early. There's also a level of complacency because we're doing well on so many cancers. I think people are less engaged on screening. That's been in effect since COVID. We've seen screening rates go down, and are they recovering enough? So there's a lot of public awareness, and it needs to be much more than just a basic information, a real engagement with the public to understand how they themselves can contribute to eradicating cancer.
Thank you.
So just to add further, I think the great thing about the NHS is a public health system with the ability of medical information to flow across it to centres. So, and that's unlike in North America, where you have isolated hospitals. And the second great element we have that is the referral system through general practice, so the first tier. We could certainly improve our ability to get both those to deliver better. So, for instance, at the general practice level, that allows a very ideal platform for screening, for early detection. So much of this could be done in the primary care setting rather than in big hospitals where the expenses rise and so forth. And then turning towards the hospitals, as we go into a landscape where cancer care will require and it becomes more intensive and requires specialized centers, then you can have the ability or the freedom for people to travel across that, so that we're able to provide the best and most comprehensive care to people who have advanced cancers. And then finally, we shouldn't forget about what we do about the other aspects of cancer, which is better and more effective pain control, and then end-of-life care. And we just need to be better joined up in all these aspects, and we should be able to deliver. The final thing I would say is that in the UK, we have this great repository of health records, which we can then harness back to understand the origins of cancer. So, as you know, the famous project of UK Biobank, which has transformed the study of human disease in populations, and now with our Future Health, are two very powerful platforms, can only really happen in the UK ecosystem.
Thank you. I was heartened to hear from the department they are intending to bring back a cancer plan. So that is good news. I hear from both of you themes around detection. If we can focus on that just for a moment. I mean, there's, I think, £70 million which has been earmarked for new radiotherapy machines. Off the top of your head, do you know how much a radiotherapy machine costs? Because I don't.
Very difficult question to answer. Not a lot of transparency there.
Will that make a dent? Is the question I'm really asking. You know, £70 million for new radiotherapy machines, given that many of them are old. I mean, what in this detection space is going to be needed to shift the dial, as opposed to tinkering around the edges in terms of funding? Is that a question you feel able to answer?
I can provide a follow-up response for you on that.
And you know, yes, cancer rates have improved certainly recently, but we do also know that the UK is behind a number of other comparable countries. What are they doing differently?
That's a very good question. I think our cure rates or our survival rates are the ones that are taking the biggest impact. I think certainly when you present with more advanced cancers, the treatment requirements are intensive. And I think in certain countries, they have much greater centers of specialism in order to do this. We have great inequalities of provision of healthcare in the UK. If you take the coastal part of Britain compared to where they're in the southeast at the big epicenters of the big cities, and certainly university cities, the disparity there is much greater, right? So I think that does have an impact, is my guess, but it is something we really need to better understand. Why is it that we lag behind? The other element is, of course, the delay in referral. If a GP suspects you have cancer, the speed at which you get to the hospital and then have your diagnostic test and then your definitive treatment plan, this may be shorter in countries which have more successful outcomes. Well, we do need to get to that space.
Dr. Torode, do you have Anything to add?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate that the radiotherapy is a curative modality. We often get focused on the medicines, but both surgery and radiotherapy add to the cure, particularly in head and neck, cervical cancer, prostate cancer. Radiotherapy is quite a critical modality. Why are we not doing so well versus other high-income countries? I think you have to look at also the cost benefit. I think there's a lot of over treatment. At what point do you stop treatment and support patients in a palliative situation? You have to think of the time toxicity for a patient. Maybe those last few months and weeks are better spent at home with family, preparing and living a productive life in those last few months, rather than the fifth line, sixth line, seventh line treatment that is likely to give a poorer return. So I think we should consider having a broader conversation around the last period of life and what survival means for patients, and it's very much something that patients should be contributing to. But I do agree that it's the referral process that we need to look at. There are these hidden delays between detection and confirmed diagnosis, between confirmed diagnosis and starting treatment, which can be looked at. And I think there are inequities that we need to look at in the country as well, because I think you can refine, but if they're only focused on those patients that are getting good access, you actually need to look at those pockets of the population that aren't coming for early detection or aren't engaging and completing treatment. And what reasons do they have? Is that remoteness, English as not as a primary language? There are lots of different factors, low socioeconomic status and educational status, and we know those factors. So how do we actually integrate more targeted activities with those key populations? Because that maybe is what pulling our overall survival statistics down, rather than the intervention.
What I'm finding interesting about your interventions is that it seems what we're saying is, the focus of the committee's report in the last session was around future cancer. The theme that we've been speaking about today is sort of future innovations, and it's very exciting. But then when we get to the nub of this, it would seem that it's getting some of the basics right that is going to make a massive difference. You're both nodding your heads. But I'm looking for specifics. So let's take the GP point. They've got 10 minutes in order to not just focus on this, but also mental health, but also stroke, cardiovascular disease. What is needed to help the GPs get those referrals right first time?
I can't speak authoritatively in this area because I'm a basic cancer researcher, but what we do need is a more comprehensive approach to how we roll out screening, making sure that on a GP's list, all the people that should be entering, be offered screening, that the cut through happens, that they're communicated clearly and then referred for, whether it's breast mammography or so forth. So we could improve in that area. I would say that that's one area that we could improve. When it comes to actually referring people onto a hospital from the GP base, well, it's to do with the pressure points of the local hospital and maybe the ability to really cross-refer to hospitals that are that have more capacity than those that are locally positioned.
Understood.
I cannot speak authoritatively in this area.
And you're not clinician, so I fully understand that. And just to go back to the research side of it, I mean, they're not going to be able to fund everything all the time. And of the many innovations of which you'd already listed a number, what are the ones you would bet on? If the NHS was to, have any extra money in this space, where would you bet?
So a couple of areas that I think could be transformative. The first is AI and machine learning approaches to interpret radiography, right. Or biopsy or smear specimens. The error rate in some papers that have been published is much lower than the human eye. So you don't need to employ a person. You could get more turnover and speed through these approaches. That's one very positive way one could go forward. And the second is a slightly more speculative, but certainly in trials now, which is a blood test that can detect cancer earlier. So when you form a cancer, it sheds its DNA into the circulation. And there are several innovative approaches that seem to be able to detect these cancers, this DNA, and then essentially warn us that you might have an early cancer somewhere in your body.
Dr. Torode?
We're not quite there yet, but we need to. I can see that being transformative in the future.
Yeah, I think linking into the past point is understanding the risk of the population and finding ways to, we can tell, for example, through some genetic markers already, whether a family is at risk. That already gives us an ability for heightened surveillance of family members who don't yet have cancer. And that area, I think, is going to be increasingly an area of research and increasing learning. So it comes back to the GP managing a population that has varying cancer risk, varying age and opportunity to engage with early detection, and almost maybe incentivizing GPs to look at their community around them as keeping cancer away from these people rather than waiting until something is arriving.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lalloo. And I think that the theme of getting the basics right, and we heard this morning from AMLO, a innovative diagnostic company who was having challenges diffusing their new technology into the NHS. But I certainly like the idea of GPs as protectors of their community from cancer, and I'm sure Lalloo, you'll be looking at the cancer pathways and the GP primary care pathways as well. Now we're going to move on to what I think is which I hope is a good example of the different factors involved in eradicating or reducing significantly a particular cancer. And I'm going to ask Alison to move us on to cervical cancer, which is a relative success story, I hope.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the HPV vaccination, so in the shortness of time I'll just jump straight to that. How important is public awareness and education for the global eradication of cervical cancer, but also not just with cervical cancer, but also the fact that this vaccination can deal with other cancers that would be relevant to boys and their vaccinations as well?
So, should I go first?
Sorry.
I think it's crucial to have awareness for this. I think in many rich countries, we're much ahead because people understand the opportunity of HPV vaccination. On the flip side, we sometimes give too much press to unpasteurized scientific views in this arena. And we're not that effective at closing this down, because once you see doubt in a population, as the famous case of the MMR vaccination, it's very difficult to shift that, right? But we're pretty, it's about controlling misinformation in rich societies so that we're able to form a very good, informed and clear choice. In the more general world, it's more complicated because there are cultural issues that come into play. But it's a shock to think here's a very simple intervention that takes away a dreadful disease, and nobody should really suffer that. No women or a man should suffer HPV-induced cancers because it's completely preventable. But I think it'll be bespoke for different countries and different societies, and the level of investment that might go into that. And in the end, how do you roll out a national vaccination program?
Dr. Torode.
Yeah, I mean, cervical cancer is a good example of a global disparity where today in the UK, it's quite a rare cancer. Screening in particular has brought those rates down, and vaccination is now adding to that in lower middle income countries and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, we are seeing it as the #1 killer of women and a high-ranking cancer in their cancer burden overall. And that is quite tragic when, and as Professor Patel has said, it's a completely preventable cancer. So the World Health Organization does have a global elimination initiative, and it takes a 3-pronged approach. 90% coverage of HPV vaccination, 70% coverage for screening, plus 90% coverage of treatment, whether that be pre-cancers or cancer itself. And that's quite an ambitious set of targets for countries to reach. But during those consultations, I think particularly the high burden countries were quite motivated because they will uniquely benefit. HPV vaccination is obviously a crux of that, because if you can have a cohort of young people becoming adults and coming into the risk age for cancer, but they've been protected with HPV vaccination. What we're already seeing in the cervical cancer screening programs in higher income countries, and Scotland and Australia in particular have shown data here that we now have women of cancer forming age where we're not seeing those pre-cancers that we would have seen in screening programs earlier. So the ambition globally is to get that new generation of people growing up being protected against HPV. And so the importance there is getting that vaccination before onset of sexual debut, because it is a prophylactic vaccine. It has to be given before HPV infection. And if you get a high enough coverage in the population of girls, you can in fact also prevent boys from getting HPV. But of course, as the price of HPV vaccination is coming down, also we've shifted. If you can remember, we had 3 doses of HPV some time ago. We're now shifting to single dose. It's absolute game changer for low middle income countries in terms of affordability, but also the logistics of actually delivering that single dose. And they certainly will be enough in the UK.
One final question, because I know a colleague wants to ask a little bit more about the HPV vaccine. I'm running out of time. You referenced the fact that cervical cancer and HPV, it can be sexually transmitted. Do you find that we need to do an education awareness or rebrand it out beyond that narrow focus? Because there are in some countries and cultures where it is seen as shameful to do that, about sexual activity. So, looking at the fact it will help with a broader range of cancers as prevention might help.
I think that's a good example of segmented messaging to different populations and their risk. The driver of cervical cancer in low middle income countries is in fact HIV. People living with HIV have 6 to 10 times the likelihood women of getting cervical cancer. And in fact, if you have an HIV infection, you're twice as likely to get HPV and vice versa. So there is that sexually transmitted route, then, and the education is certainly important. What we're finding, though, in low middle income countries is it's the actual anti-cancer story that is motivating people to take up HPV vaccination. But that includes then explaining to people what cancer is, what the cervix is. These are all new terminologies for people. They see people dying of cervical cancer, but they don't necessarily know what that means. So the strong message from international work is it's the anti-cancer message that motivates people to take the vaccination. And it takes away that complex discussion around sexually transmitted infection when you're actually trying to get parents to vaccinate their young children. I think in older cohorts, particularly people with high risk profiles like sex workers or people that might be engaging at an older age on the opportunity to have catch-up vaccine, such as the LGBTQ community. There, I think you can have a more differentiated message around sexually transmitted risks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Dr. Torode, and indeed Professor KJ Patel. I think it's useful to finish, if you like, on cervical cancer, which you described, Professor Patel, as an entirely preventable disease, and which is, I think, can gives us all hope to see its elimination in our lifetimes. I was very struck looking at the take-up of cervical screening in my constituency some years ago, that there was a 50 percentage points difference between two wards. In one ward it was 24%, in another ward it was 75%. And the messages that you've spoken to about communication, about access for different populations, as well as I think it was described as a trifecta of prevention and vaccination and treatment. You know, those are all really important messages which give us a sense of the challenges with all the different diseases. It's been fascinating to look at this morning. It's very hopeful. I think we've been spreading Christmas cheer in many areas, as well as really understanding the hard yard still to be run. Before we do see really the eradication or the reduction of these diseases, which have such a huge burden on so many different countries around the world. So once again, science, I think, at its best. And thank you so much for spending the time with us, and thanks to the committee for your questions and the engagement. And Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Order.